Great. I don't really need to introduce myself. You can find me on Twitter at @Waterman if you need to talk to me. And everybody's in the schedule too. So great. Off we go. So I had planned this talk out as a really technical talk. I wanted to show you a bunch of stuff, linking up browsers and web archives and search engines and all this kind of stuff. And I kind of got through that plan and I thought, well, what the hell's the point? Because it doesn't make a lot of sense, some of it anyway, unless you put it in a bigger context. And as I started to explore the context, I thought, well, this is a much more rich area to talk about. So I'm going to be talking more about the fundamental architecture of what text is and what the web is and how those fit together. So since all the other stuff today, or a lot of it's about data engineering and science and NLP and that sort of stuff, and you kind of need a grounding in what the matter you're working is when you're doing science, consider this your daily dose of philosophy and history of science. So if it gets a little weird, just remember that. So I want to talk about how we got to now with text. Because text is a funny thing. And where are we actually at now, and what does now span? And then do a little blue sky, or not so blue sky, some near-term projections on where we're going with how we interact with text and what text is in the world. So this is the question I'm trying to answer today. What really is text? And text is not written speech. If I gave my whole talk like that, you'd kill me, right? It's a very different thing entirely. So let me say that a different way. If I write it out this way, it looks different. It's got all the properties of text that you recognize. So either I'm going to spend the next half an hour explaining the background of all this, or I'm just going to bore you to tears. So text really is the original technology. It's literally technology. It comes from the same root as art and craftsmanship. It's an artifact. It's something that we as humans created for a task, for a purpose. So let's consider it a technology. What does it actually do? It's a user interface. It's a way to preserve and communicate and translate speech. And by speech, we mean human communication, which is composed of words and probably ultimately represents thoughts if you go that route. Like I said, it's an artifact. We had to invent it. It's changed incredibly over the span of use, and I'm going to talk maybe a little too much about that span and how it's changed, and sort of give you the versions of it as we go. But like any technology, it's got huge problems. Although we use it every day, we swim in it, it's completely non-intuitive. It's the one technology that we spend literally years teaching kids how to use. How do you read? How do you write? How do you construct a thought? How do you compose an essay? How do you get through a newspaper? How do you know which place to go on the web and which place not to go on the web? If you've got kids, that's a big issue. And over time, it's got huge, like any technology, huge interoperability problems. You have different scripts, you have different languages, you have different writing styles, you have different media. They're all buggy, they all suck, and we use them all the time. So as an artifact, what are some of the useful properties of text? It's visual. You look at it, you don't have to hear it. You can actually read silently. I think it took people a few thousand years to figure that out. And there's a lot of good evidence for that, but we'll talk about that. It's nonlinear in the way that speech is linear. One word has to come after another because you can't speak them all at once. all the words on a page or in a document are there all at once, atemporally. They're just there. You can pick it up, you can move it around, you can mix it, you can add stuff to it, you can annotate it. It's totally accretable and rearrangeable and movable, and you can do all kinds of things. So, like I was saying, I want to talk about how we got here. How did this stuff, what are the early stage developments of text? And then meta-text is an interesting category, which I want to spend some time on. As we write about and describe and label and tag text, the medium we use, the technology we use, is also text. And so that itself becomes part of the thing that we're looking at. So if we're looking at processing text and trying to understand it and trying to use computers to understand it, or at least manipulate it, knowing that all of that is actually part of the same subject matter is really important. I'm going to blow through the modern history of computers and hypertext and land on the web and search engines and computability and talk a little bit about where we're going to go. And like I said, I'm not going to talk a lot about search and IR and NLP and sentiment analysis and word vectors and all the things you've been hearing about this morning and we'll hear about this afternoon, because that's your day job, right? We do that all the time. So I want to take this as an opportunity to explore how all that stuff fits together so we can see what it means. So one of the great advantages of text, if you're looking at it from a historical perspective, is that it's written history. The jokes sort of write themselves here. So any artifact that's left around is written. You can kind of know what it means. You can kind of piece it together, except for all of those scripts and languages and artifacts that you can't because nobody's figured them out yet, right? So if you look at Minoan linear A, nobody can read it. And so there's a big chunk of history that's just missing. So it's history, it's code, it's basically got its own source control mechanism because the versions are written down. You can look at what happens 50 years later, what happens a century later. And that's what we'll talk about. So the written word is by itself a totally remarkable invention. It's a representation of speech, which is this activity you do. We don't really have good, other representations of things we do in the same way. How do you write down going to the grocery store and buying lunch, except as a representation of the words you would use to communicate them. So it's just a profoundly weird thing in and of itself. Let's go over the history a little bit. So about 5,000 years ago, you start seeing text show up all over the place. And it's surprising how uniformly all over the old world it shows up. And all of the early scripts are the same form. They're basically logoforms, logographs. There's one symbol per word. And that persists for a couple thousand years. It takes people a really long time of using this and writing it and rewriting it and copying it and putting it on statues and seeing it every day to boil it down and start to simplify it as a UI. And so over those couple thousand years, you start to see phonetic symbols get introduced. People actually are just representing, instead of the meaning of the thing you say, they just represent the sound. And that's good enough, because if you can go from the sound back to the word, you can then say the word to yourself and know what it meant and keep going. But that simple insight takes a couple thousand years in the development of human history. And so somewhere around 1000 BC, you see the first instance of what we'd really call a modern phonetic alphabet, which is early Greek, in which there's this really simplified set of symbols, just a couple dozen symbols So all of this complex, hieroglyphics and cuneiform and all this stuff is boiled down to a couple dozen symbols, all written with straight lines that are basically so simple a child could remember them and draw them, which is exactly the point. A child could remember them and draw them. We get the Latin alphabet showing up out of a form of Greek about 500 years later. In India, East Asia, you start to see Brahmi script, which is one of the precursors to Devanagari, which is another phonetic script. The main holdout here is China and Central Asia. While all around it, all sorts of cultures are inventing phonetic scripts, the Chinese have stuck with this complex logoform for 5,000 years, which says something about the centralized political control in China and how it's never, ever going to go away. But that's another issue. Besides just the form of the alphabet, how you write it down and how it's structured is a huge part of what text is. If you look at any page or any display or anything with text, it's not just a stream of characters that you have to break up and figure out. Except it is, for 2,000 years. It's exactly what it is. So this is the earliest story that we actually have evidence for. It's about 3,200 BC. It's the tale of Gilgamesh and the flood. And it's literally just a sequence of characters. There's a little bit of white space here and there. But there are no sentence breaks, there are no word breaks, there are sort of chapter breaks in that you fit as much as you can onto one of these tablets, which are really small, by the way. It's about the size of a paperback. And so that's 5,000 years ago. 2,000 years later, so this is the Constitution of Athens, written out by Aristotle in, 300 or 400 BC, in what we consider classic Greek. There are no word breaks. There are no headings. There are no page numbers. There are nothing. There's no visible structure. And it's designed to be read linearly, as if you were speaking it. If you read this out, it's kind of conversational. It's like if somebody had transcribed this talk. It's just it's structured internally by the rhetoric, but it's not structured physically and visually. And so as a UI, it's missing something. It's missing a lot of things that we take for granted now. And so I want to go through the history of the next while and talk about where all that comes in. So with Latin, even as opposed to Greek, we start seeing word breaks, what they call interpunct in Latin, right? Little dots between the words. Shortly after, you see this thing in Greek called a paragraph. It goes alongside the graph. It's just a little mark that says, here's a new thought, here's a new sentence. And that'll be critical as we go. So somewhere around 200, Latin loses its mind. And they decide, we don't need word separators anymore. And it mostly stays that way for the next 400 or 500 years. And that's kind of just as the Roman Empire is peaking. Whether it was sort of a political elite thing to try to keep people from reading or not, it's kind of unclear. A few hundred years later, Latin decides, we really did need word breaks, and so spaces appear. And they also get casing. They get a minuscule form, small letters. People are writing in cursive. It's much faster to write. It's much easier to transcribe. It takes up less space also. So this valuable stuff that you're writing on, you don't have to use as much of it. It takes another 500,000 years for people to put paragraph markers in Latin and the Western European languages. And then, finally, right around the time of the printing press, people are finally just starting to do things like indent paragraphs and get a spatial form for what's going on. So here's some examples, just for fun. This is the story of Tristan and Isolde from about 1300. It's written in French. There are word spaces. There are minimal dots for sentence ends. There are no capitals except for sort of these chapter heading capitals. They tell you this begins a major section of the story. There's no other structure to this. It's just a story, as if you just narrated it at a sermon or a campfire or wherever you're telling your story. Few hundred years later, you start seeing marks. These are paragraph marks to divide sentences in a manuscript from Germany. The letter forms have changed. They start to look more readable, more modern. This is what they call Carolinian minuscule or Carolingian. But at the same time as this, as things are still being written out by hand that look like that, you get this. And this, if you don't know, is well, who would? It's the Gutenberg Bible. It's in a really uniform type because it's actually a uniform type. They were all cast in lead from the same mold, so it looks good. But the spacing is horrible. The German black letters gives you sort of no shape, form to read on the words, and there's just as little semantic layout as there's been for the previous, 5,000 years. There's just nothing. So one thing, if you're interested in all this stuff, you don't have to go, to the Louvre or the British Museum anymore to see these things, because they've digitized huge collections of them, and you can find almost all of them on the web. So if you go to the British Library, you can see manuscripts carefully digitized from, 3000 BC up to the present day. It's really amazing. A little more on form and layout. This is some of the big stuff. So for the first few thousand years, if it wasn't literally written in stone, it was on papyrus. And there's some oddballs like slats of wood, and some people were using parchment and that sort of stuff. But papyrus was the word of the day. And it was all rolled up. So you had, it starts as a cylinder, you unroll it, you get to see about this much, and you keep unrolling it because you don't have the space to roll out, 3 meters of this stuff. So you can sort of see one page at a time, and it's linear, just like the text. There's no way to put in a bookmark and go, remember something interesting toward the end, because there's just no physical format for it. Around 200, the codex comes out. It's a bound book of leaves, the kind of thing that we'd instantly recognize as a book. And it begins to gain a lot of popularity, and in the space of just a few hundred years, wipes out the scroll in all manuscript manufacture. And one of the reasons for this is it's not necessarily because it was better. The codex was introduced time and again over the preceding 500 years ago, before this, and hadn't caught on. And the reason it did catch on this time seems to be that it had a small set of really committed, fervent users, real evangelists for the cause. And literally, because these were the Christians, and they decided that they were going to write the Christian Bible as a codex rather than a scroll. And it begins to catch on. We start to see things like chapter headings barely appearing in the late medieval period. We didn't really see any in the examples I showed. Suddenly we get the printing press in 1440. Things start to change, mostly because of the volume of production. In the next 50 years after this, there will be more books printed and produced than there were papyrus scrolls written out in the previous 2,000 years. Finally, 1,000 years after the codex, somebody puts page numbers in the damn book so that you can talk about it and say, you know, oh, it's that piece beginning on page 73. And this wasn't really important before because every copy of a book, you know, if you write out the works of Aristotle, each time you write it out, it's going to have a different pagination. And so my copy is going to be different from your copy, is going to be different from everybody else's copy. So there's no uniformity to text as a UI in this sense until we start getting automation into the process. And that'll be a theme. As soon as we automate stuff, it changes dramatically. And that obviously is true of the last 100 years. We start to see things like running page heads. So if you open a book in the middle, you kind of know what section you're in because it says, rather than just being, you know, page 73, it actually says, you know, section 3 on solids or whatever it says in Aristotle. Sort of organizational meta content doesn't really show up until well into the Enlightenment. You start getting tables of contents, back of the book index, reference sections really show up in the 20th century. It's a really modern invention, right? So we all write scientific papers. We're reading all these technical papers all the time. There's footnotes, bibliographies, citations. That wasn't there 100 years ago. Nobody had them. We'll show some examples. And again, some of this stuff isn't new to this era. It just starts to catch on. So table of contents, Pliny's history in 70-ish AD had an actual table of contents, you know, labeling out what each book was going to be about. The fact that each book was a separate scroll and they were all in a box and there were about 100 of them, maybe that contributed to it. But they all actually had tags, like literal tags on string hanging off the end of the roll telling you what the thing was. So it took a while for the technology to catch on. All these things that we think of as really useful as sort of interaction design and UI aren't nearly as obvious as they are after the fact. And that's, well, we'll talk about that more. So here's an example of how crappy some stuff is. This is the first edition of Newton's Principia. This is actually Newton's Principia. This is his copy of the Principia. They've got it at the British Library with his annotations and marks and things like that, because he made a bunch of corrections that went into the second edition when he fixed up the calculus 30 years later. It does have page numbers. It does have some kind of loose section marking. It's got no table of contents. It's got no index. It's got no running heads. You open it in the middle. You don't know where you are. You have to read the thing linearly to understand, or stick in a bunch of bookmarks. And it's in goddamn Latin. So English-speaking science, beginning of the Royal Society, everybody's actually doing their work in English, but the official text of the time is Latin, which means it's really limited. 50 years later, it's finally translated to English. There's a volume out that has running heads and this sort of thing. It takes more than a century after it came out for there to be a copy that had a back of the book index, right? And it's still the same English translation that was made 75 years before that. So this book that's kind of the centerpiece of the scientific revolution in Europe still didn't get any attention from a usability perspective. So as we work with data and computers and things, know that it's really hard. However, at the same time, other people are starting to do stuff that actually looks like a modern book. This is sort of a history of London. It's got page numbers, it's got running heads, it's got margin comments, it's got liberal use of different typefaces to try to indicate different kinds of contents. They actually have quotations, which are kind of interesting because they're not bracketed. They're sort of a running marginalia against the quoted section to make you know that that's somehow special. Sort of thing that you might use, color for, or set it off in block print or something these days. Okay, so all these things, layout and metadata and all this stuff around the actual content words, they're the API to the content in the text. And so if we start to think about them as an API and put on our engineer programming hats, you can begin to understand how everything fits together and how you can make better use of text today with the tools we have. I've got 14, but good enough. So we'll talk about all these things. Library catalogs start to come out as the collection of books gets bigger. At the beginning, they're literally a bibliography. Somebody wrote down the books. So you'd have a library with 500 books. You'd actually make a list so you know what's where and which ones you lent to your friends and that kind of thing. And you might only have 500 books if you were bloody rich. As size of collections come up, actually cataloging things becomes important. French Revolution, they seize all this property. They suddenly have a national library. What's in here? Right? This stuff's obviously valuable, but you need to catalog it. Same is true of the Library of Congress here in the States, the British Library. And in the 1900s, you suddenly get sort of much more rigorous and meaningful classifications. So the same thing that Linnaeus did with the animal taxonomy in the Enlightenment, we now have to do with books about everything because there's suddenly enough books that it makes a difference. Most of you are old enough to have used one of these. And this is a university library. It's huge. There are thousands of drawers by author, by subject, by title, and you have to paw through them and find what you want. Maybe we could monetize this, put a little ad on every card because you're there all the time. But so that's the indexing system to see what books you have. But when you're writing about them and cross-referencing them in the content, that bit of API, again, took a long time. So for about 3,000 years, references were exactly that. They're references. As you're talking along, you say, oh yeah, in Aristotle, he said blah, blah, blah. So these are two things from the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, right around 1700. The first one mentions a treatise by Christian Huygens, and the next one talks about Bernoulli. But that's exactly, they talk about them, right? So I used the theorem from Mr. Bernoulli that he wrote in 1694. Great. There's no actual citation until we actually, this is 150 years later, mid-1800s. You suddenly start seeing things that look a little bit like modern citations in scientific papers. And this is after the discovery of electricity and oxygen and all kinds of stuff. Now we start to see this stuff. And again, these are all from the Proceedings of the Royal Society, which you can actually now just go read from your living room, from your laptop. So spent a long time talking about the last few thousand years, because a lot happened. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the last 100 years, because even more has happened. But you're probably familiar with more of this. So I put Punchcards at the top, because this is the first time that text is now represented as something that's totally non-obvious. before you wrote down text on a piece of paper or a wall or a stone carving, and it was there as text. It was a code. You had to know the code. You had to read it, but you could. Now it's in little holes on pieces of paper and boxes, and you can't read it. And so this era assumes this ever-growing complex set of machinery that you need, that you absolutely need to understand text. Most of the text I consume these days is on one of these things. It's on a computer. To read an Aristotle scroll from 2,500 years ago, I don't need any technology, except maybe an air-conditioned room and the permission of the librarians. But to read, the proceedings of a technical conference, I need $1,000 worth of equipment. I need internet infrastructure. I need all this stuff. So hopefully there's something on this list that maybe you aren't familiar with. There's been a lot that happened in the last 100 years until 20, 30 years ago when we suddenly got the web, which really has changed everything. And it's the biggest change since what? Since the printing press? It's more than that. It's at least the biggest change since the codex, and it might be the biggest change since the alphabet. It provides a lot of things. Random access, very persistent data. It's mixable in a way that actual printed, written text never was. And it's universal. It's really all connected. And in some ways, you can think of it, and I'll show that you should think of it as one thing. It's not like it's a paper here and a page there and a tweet there. It's really all one thing, and you're looking at a page of it. And this is why maybe we call these web things pages. And the link in HTML, the href, is really the thing that does this. It abstracts this horribly complex process of reading a citation, figuring out what it is, going to find it, whether it's on your shelf or on your desk near at hand, or whether you have to go to the library, or whether you have to travel to another city to get it. It's a long process. And now it all becomes one thing. So it changes this horrible process of going and looking stuff up and looping around through the catalog and looking at the stacks and getting your book to something that's maybe as simple as flipping a page. And we call them web pages for a reason, I think. So I think this is where we are now. And I'm just going to posit that text is this giant collection of stuff. We don't have a bunch of different documents and different things. We've got a web of stuff, the same way you had a library of stuff 100 years ago. So it used to be that the substrate that we had was dumb. It didn't do anything for you. And now it's totally active, not only locally on your device or in your pocket. Everybody's got one of these. It's got more compute power than the world had 50 years ago. But it's smart. So I'm actually going to run a couple minutes over. It's so tough. But the web isn't all linked together. There's a lot of links missing. At the early days, 20 years ago, if you wrote out a web page, which you did in a text editor, you put in the links yourself. You tried to link to authoritative content. You tried to make it interesting. Now there's too much stuff. It's always changing. You don't put that link in because you know it's not going to be there in 6 months and your page is going to look screwed up. You leave it to the search engine. You leave it to the CMS system. You leave it to some automatic process. So we already have automatic processes tied intimately into the stuff we're writing. But at least for some of these things, it pushes the effort off to the reader. So instead of just following that link, and clicking, you read a page. You go to Google, you get some results, you loop around through the results, you have to read stuff, figure out what it meant. Finally, you go someplace. So the search engine is taking this giant collection of data and munging it all up and turning it into something that is actually usable. And it adds this layer of global intelligence onto the text. And I guess one of the things I'm trying to claim today is that global intelligence is now part of the text. The same way that page numbers became part of the text 1,000 years ago, the search engine, the CMS, the whatever, is part of the text. So it's smart enough to actually tell you, what's related and what's going on. It can figure this out with your really dumb 2.7 word query. I used to work at Bing. The kinds of queries you'd see in the log are amazingly short and crappy, and you'd still have to return something useful. And it does. And it does that by watching what everybody is doing. So not only is the compute system now part of the text, the actual writing, creation, reading, using, operating with it is really part of the system. And if you think of it all as a system, it can change your perspective. I'm going to skip. So one of the problems you get, since nobody's putting in links for you, or maybe they're local, one newspaper has a bunch of internal links, gives you related stuff to read. Your Facebook page has only stuff from your friends. You don't really know where you are. You don't know what the rest of the stuff is. You've kind of lost, you've lost your peripheral vision of what's going on. And in fact, often you don't even know what's behind the link on the page, or especially on the phone, right? You get a web page on the phone, there's a little link. It's hard to see the URL, whatever. Apple's starting to help by giving you a preview for that stuff so that you can kind of figure out what's going on, what's happening. But these layers are pretty dumb. So the thing I wanted to close with is some investigation and some commentary on where this is all going. Because these layers really are adding intelligence, human intelligence, and AI, and machine learning, and all this stuff that we all do in our day jobs, are becoming part of the system. And if you want the stuff that you're doing to be a successful part of the system, you should understand the whole kind of ecology of it and figure out where you fit in. So, these are literally off the cuff, things you might want the text to do for you. Things that the browser plus some global compute resource like Google, or now you can almost build this yourself for the top 5 million web pages. It really doesn't cost a lot on Amazon. I've done it. The page itself can tell you what other people think about it. You can see other people's comments on this content. You can find out what your own community thinks about this particular page. You can sort of the page can be smart and instantly find all that stuff that's related to it, that's out there in the world. You can look through your own history to find, that thing that I lost last week. Where was it, right? You can do the same search engine search and try to find it. Or the system that you're interacting with can just remember that. It can sort of build automatic encyclopedic references for the things that it's reading, because it can read it. It's sort of dumb right now. It can't make sense of it the way you can, but there's enough NLP out there that you can sort of automatically glue all this stuff together. And the point is that it's not. None of this stuff is crazy blue sky stuff, because it's already here. You've seen bits and pieces of it and this and that, and just like the fact that page numbers took a couple hundred years to really come into play, or the alphabet took 1,000 years to kind of develop out of this other stuff, it's coming. We've hit time. I had some things and products that are out there that demonstrate some of this stuff. I'm happy to talk about more of them with people after the talk. And I'm happy to, the slides will be online with all this. So I want to say thank you for waiting for your lunch until I finish. And let's have a good day here.